All right, so yeah, we're going into section 13. Like again, forgive me if you can hear the hammers and the sawing behind me and everything like that. Walls aren't super thick, but we'll talk about basically introduction to HTML, introduction to CSS. Like I said before I started recording, is that we're going to do more of an intro, just enough for us to do web scraping. It's not really much for us to like build a website. That's not what our goal is. Our goal is basically learn enough so we can actually pull information out and actually do some web scraping ourselves. And we'll try to touch that at the very end of this. Okay, so let me go ahead and I guess I should share my screen. And so let's see here. There's my screen. I think that's my screen. Okay, cool. And of course you guys disappear on me. Why do you guys have to leave me? There you are. You guys are always in different spots too when I start sharing my screen. All right. And so just for the record, there have been some changes for oops, that's not the right one. The repo that I put these lessons in. So just kind of know that if you haven't kind of updated it for a while, it's not quite, it might need to be like, refreshed or pulled. What we're going to talk about is the data engineering part, which is a little confusing, I know, but we're going to do data engineering. We're going to go into web scraping. So Sharonda, if you are, I'll send this out on the Zoom chat too, so you guys have access to that. I think you might have seen this before, but just know the lessons we're going to talk about are these two right here. Okay, cool. So we'll go into web scraping and we'll talk about HTML, CSS, right? So quick kind of poll, like give me a thumbs up. You can say something in the chat. Who has seen HTML before? Cool. All right. See a lot of thumbs up.
Only from this course.
Only from this course? All right, that's perfectly fine. Okay, cool. Cool, Rebecca, I need to check that out. You sent. So yeah, so that means you guys have some, maybe a little experience. Sharonda, I'm guessing you've seen a little bit since you said you were kind of playing with the IDE and stuff like that.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Cool. So this will make it nice and easy. So this is kind of go by relatively quickly, hopefully. But basically, the first part is like, what is web scraping itself? So I kind of put these in order of like preference. There's not like a strict preference of like what this is supposed to be or like, what's the proper order of it. But I like to kind of preference as saying like, we like to have clean data first, and clean data meaning like it's easily accessible, is able for us to do analysis very quickly from it. And kind of like that preference is kind of like direct access. So it's on your computer, it's available to you right there. Usually that means either a database or a CSV. Essentially, we can either import the CSV, or sorry, read the CSV directly into a data frame. We can, read a query like from a MySQL query, for example, and pull that into, a data frame as well. So it's relatively easy to do. I say database meaning like usually it's like locally, where it's not going to take a long time for the network to think about it. Afterwards, it's kind of like API call. API call is like the next best one. It's not as nice. Why might APIs? Why might based off like CSV and database? Why might I say APIs are like the second best from database and CSV? And you got to guess based on what you know on APIs.
I mean, there's like some of them might just return like a messier format.
Right. So it's a little more unpredictable format in the sense of that it's not going to be this nice structured table format that we're used to in the data frame. You're going to probably have to do some extra, finagling with it and making sure it works fine. So yeah, you're exactly right, Andy. So API call is kind of like that second thing. And then the third one, like I kind of mentioned this before, we call it scraping data. Data munging. It's like we got like all these like dirty terms for like data, and basically this is kind of like on the lower end. And basically you have to get the data yourself and collect it from different sources, and it's a lot of work. It can also be really rewarding in the sense that you have data that no one else has, so that can be pretty cool. And then the fourth one is other sources. I don't even like consider this. Other sources is like, oh, you're going to go do a survey or something like that, or some other like set up a system in case. This is probably like the worst case, like not worst case, but like probably the most amount of work. And usually it's like if it's not one of these sources, we're probably going to skip over it, or say this is maybe something like someone else can put into place. Okay, so web scraping is really important because sometimes you just can't get the data out of any other way. One example of this is like, let's say LinkedIn. LinkedIn, they don't have an API. There's not like, maybe someone collects some information, but there's not direct access to that database. If you wanted information about LinkedIn, you might want to do some web scraping to actually pull that information. Now, I'll put the little caveat. The reason I mentioned LinkedIn too is because LinkedIn purposely does not want their data to be scraped. It's kind of like their data. They don't want people to check it out. So just know that there is a bit of a gray area for scraping data. It's possible. I think right now the law is turning towards saying it's open for, if it's available, if you can see it, it's open for web scraping kind of deal, which kind of makes sense, I think, for most people's minds in the sense of being like, it's like a poster on a wall. It's like, well, the poster's on the wall. You can take a picture of that poster. That's essentially what you're doing with web scraping. You're just doing it very systematically. So just know, though, there can be some gray areas and should always be really careful, especially if it's data that maybe should not be, that should not be public. This sometimes happens when you start web scraping and you find out you can access through URLs that you shouldn't be able to access, but they messed up on how they did this. I won't name any names or anything like this or anything like experience. This is all theoretical, but I know of cases, or hypothetically know of cases, where you can get protected information by just basically changing out the URL, which you would be surprised at how many places can do this wrong, where it's actually a lot of their intellectual property where they don't keep it behind proper doors. They look like they are. Looks like you have to put into a login and password, but in reality, it's just pointing to a URL that doesn't actually isn't protected by anything. Basically, if you have the URL, you have it. So just kind of be aware of that part when you're scraping data. Okay, so legal issues aside, we'll go into how to actually scrape this stuff. So HTML, you'll see that it's kind of similar to XML, extensible markup language. We have hypertext markup language. So basically, it's going to be formatted very similar to an XML format. And essentially what it is, it's the way we kind of pass documents, essentially is a document to show what the web page is going to look like. So it basically tells an application, a web browser, right, of what things should look like. So you hear like renders this. So for example, this by itself actually is an HTML page, which is super meta, right? So we're talking about HTML with an HTML page kind of deal. But the whole idea is that this browser is taking a document that is an HTML document and actually producing something that looks like, what we'd expect from the web, okay? But it's nice about that then, since it is just a document and all it is the browser is rendering it, we can actually pull that information and basically read that document ourselves and process it however we want. Okay, so some quick syntax. It's basically specialized XML. If you know XML, you pretty much know what HTML is. It's just that HTML has a very specific ways of doing things. So the first thing is basically, we'll talk about tags. So just like in XML, their tags, they're very specific tags in HTML. So you can see here tags like P, which stand for paragraph, tell what the stuff inside is, just like XML. So you might have remember when we did that part, we said like note, or if we did like from, and then that from tag would say who it's from, that note. And same thing with this paragraph. This is saying this is going to be a paragraph and it's going to look a certain way. Okay. You'll see other parts, for example, like, links and lists and things like that. Okay. So the next part is attributes, right? So this attributes basically are this little extra information within the tag itself. So you can see here, we have actually a link tag, which I have no clue why it's labeled with A. My only guess, if I have to take a guess of it, is because it's just short. Maybe there's some history of like why this is going to be a link tag, but you'd think it'd be like link or something like that, or URL, but oh well. So anyway, this is a tag to say this is going to be a link, so I can hover over and click on it and go to that page. And this href right here is basically an attribute to say this is going to be, in this case, going to google.com. So this is very specific to that tag. Note that not every tag can use the same attributes. You can also put attributes that are essentially meaningless, that don't actually do anything. And HTML is pretty forgiving in the sense of it, all right, whatever, like you made a mistake or that's not something I know about, I'm just going to ignore it. You'll see HTML be very forgiving in that way, which can be good for you sometimes and bad for you other times. But anyway, href is going to refer to google.com. So this is basically, okay, this is a link tag. In here, this is the actual text that you'll be able to click on, and this is the website it will go to when you click on it. Cool, and of course, we always end it with a ending tag right here. Okay, so what this actually looks like, and you can actually see here, you can write HTML within Jupyter Notebook. So you can see, you can do Markdown, but also this is actual HTML. You can see is href google.com. And if I go like this, well, actually, I think this won't work, but let's see if it goes right. Yeah, this won't work. So one thing to put in here is that I'll show you guys what goes wrong. If I click on this guy, you think like, oh, it goes to google.com, but what it actually goes to is web scraping, which is like this part right here. This is the top domain. and goes to web scraping /google.com. But I wanted to go actually google.com. The way you would refer to this would be HTTP, :// This is telling, hey, use the hypertext protocol to transfer it over. Also, commonly now, HTTPS. They eventually work the same, just one has more security onto it for the user. So now you can actually see it goes to google.com. Right? Cool. Any questions on these two parts? Pretty good? Sound good? All right. Awesome. So next thing is comments. So this is actually really useful more for creating HTML. You likely will not scrape on comments because they usually don't have anything useful information. You could if you wanted to, but there's no real reason to it. But just know that these are how comments are formatted. It is a, I always forget what these are called, like I want to say a bracket, but these what do you guys call them? Maybe I'm losing the train.
A greater than, less than symbol.
Greater than, less than, right? Okay.
Yeah,
I think
carrot.
of carrot. Yeah, I think the problem is this is a carrot. A carrot looks like that.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I call it a bracket, but that's because of my physics background.
Angle bracket.
Angle bracket. I'm gonna say angle bracket. That sounds good. Okay. So we got an angle bracket left, and then an exclamation point, and then dash dash. That signifies that this is a comment. And then the comment won't finish until it sees another dash dash angle bracket. So you can have multiple line comments like this. And the real reason why this happens is because HTML doesn't care about white space. Basically, you can put as much white space between parts, including, like this right here, or for the paragraph tag, you can put extra white space and it works perfectly fine. But this basically just means it just will never show up. It won't render anything. Okay, cool. So that is the real basics. We know what XML is, so we don't have to really talk too much about that. So next part is going to be HTML structure. So notice we call this the document structure. You usually hear as HTML DOM or just the DOM. Basically, this is referring to how HTML is structured. So for most documents, especially modern times, you will see this part put in, this doc type HTML. Sometimes you'll see just HTML like this at the very beginning of your document. The reason why this is done here is so HTML5 is compatible. If you have some beginner, newbie person who doesn't know how to do proper websites, you might just see HTML. The real reason why they have this is that maybe in the future they might have other doc types, but right now it's really just HTML. So note that this will render HTML5. Okay, but within the HTML document, right, you will have parts called the head and the body. So you can see here is that this is how you would see this part, doc type HTML. Then we have the HTML part right here. So sometimes you might not see this here, but usually you will. HTML, and then within this, I tabbed it over just to make it a little more readable, but I could have all put this all in one line and it would still be valid. So just to kind of know it ignores white space. So there's the head, and then there's the body. So the head usually is telling about extra information, metadata. We'll put things like CSS in there, basically to make your web page look a certain way, or it might be extra links or extra JavaScript, like scripting language and stuff like that within here. But for the most part, this doesn't get rendered by itself. What it does get rendered is actually the body of the web page itself. So in there, you'll be things like paragraphs, headings, lists, other information, stuff like that, forms. So this is usually what you're really scraping into, okay? So this, when they talk about the DOM, this is what they're talking about, just the structure. And that's for the real basics of it. It's like, okay, you have the head and you have the body. Okay, so going over now some HTML elements. I am not gonna go all of them. I am going to go through them relatively quickly because we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it in the sense of like, you can go look this up. You can take some time going through the curriculum, going through other resources to see what these parts are. But I'll talk about the real main ones. So one is the paragraph stuff. So note that basically it's just going to make a new paragraph. So if you have a new paragraph tag, you can have multiple sentences in there. And basically it'll usually refer to that as a new paragraph. So you can think of like an article. Each one would be in that new paragraph tag. Headers, which are really important. Headers are actually something we've seen already, if you've seen my notebooks, is that this right here is actually a header too. So this is a markdown. So markdown is actually playing off of HTML itself. But basically a header is just saying like, this is the beginning of this section. And so it's marking importance, essentially saying, this is the main header, and then you may have subheader and then a subheader. I believe HTML goes down to 6, maybe 7, but I thought it was 6. I think it makes sense to go down to 6. So know that you could technically put in like 7. I think HTML just won't ignore it. So anyway, so I could have equivalently done this for here. I could have done, because remember I can write HTML directly in here. I can do H2. And usually what you'll see the difference between like different headings, for example, this is heading 1. This is heading like 3. Heading, let's see if I can do up to 5. You usually see it as like different sizes. If you are a if you're a good web developer, you realize that this is supposed to be emphasis. It's not about the size of like the title. It's supposed to mark importance in the sense of like, you know, what's the next thing inward. So you would have an H1 tag, and then H2 tags would be within H1 tags, and then there'd be an H1 tag on the outside as well. However, some developers say, screw it, I'm going to put whatever I want, and it's because it works this way. So know that this is all what it should be doing, but it might not necessarily be when you're web scraping itself. Okay. Images are usually something that's going to be scraped that you really like to have. You can use the image tag img, and then the source is basically the path to that image. The alt right here usually is used for accessibility. It really should be used for accessibility. Basically, if you have a screen reader or if the image does not load, it usually should be descriptive of that image. In reality, not always. Like, again, it depends on the web developer and what they're doing. You're basically at the mercy of whatever they write. So just kind of know that the main part you probably want is the path to the image. And that's kind of the information that you want. Note that this path is a relative path, which means that if you have something like I saw like google.com without like a slash in there, it'll go to whatever the domain it's in currently, and then with another folder. You can put in direct links and stuff like that. The best thing to do is just kind of check it out and see how these images are kind of related to each other. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to go through this really quickly. It's just different lists. These lists right here are basically either like, you can think of like numbered lists, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or it can be like unordered list where it's like bullet points or dashes and stuff going through. So that might be interesting for you to be able to scrape against. Note that for each of these lists, you have UL or OL being unordered or ordered. And then within that tag, you have the list items. That's what the LI stands for, is that each item is now a list item. So this is a way you can make sure you can pull that information that's relevant to you. Okay. And you can see here, like this, for example, is an unordered list. And you can have unordered list and then an unordered list, or you can have a list item, ordered list, and then an unordered list within that list. So it can be structured in different ways. Okay. Any questions on any of these guys so far? Pretty good? Okay, cool. All right, so tables, I'm gonna mention tables because tables are like super important, because usually that's where, if you see a table, you probably want that data in there. For the record, there used to be structures put in place where you would use tables to like have your web page structured in a certain way, like kind of like it replaced, basically CSS replaced this. But just know sometimes, depending on what kind of website you kind of come across, they might have their website structured with tables. So just kind of be aware of that, is that not all the time table is relevant information, but usually as a data scientist, if we're scraping against a website, if we find a table element, that's usually the stuff that we want. Okay. And so note that this table here is broken into TR elements right here, just like the LI elements over from the list. Okay, and this basically, it's like table row. So you can think of like each of these TRs are table rows. And then you can see in here is that in this case, we actually have TH, which is table header. Okay, so you can see here basically each of these rows is essentially a column, header 0, header 1, header 2, right, going in each part. And you can see here rendered on this part going forward. TD stands for table data. Basically, it's a datum, right? It's a single item. So you can see here is data item 0, first column, you can see going forward. Okay. Now this is a nice, very pretty table. There are ways to structure tables so they span different number of rows and stuff like that. Be kind of aware of that. I'm not going to go through the whole like different parts of it, but you can look at how to make tables. And if you're curious, it's row span and column span. Okay. So that's kind of like the overall structures of the most prevalent, most important information that you'll probably scrape against. Were there any questions about like, you know, table or structure, or, you know, how any of these parts would be relevant to scraping itself? I think it's pretty straightforward, right? Cool. Just checking. All right, cool. So So speaking of like, these are your basics, we have HTML5, which HTML5 just went wild with every tag possible. Basically, they started adding a whole bunch of different stuff. So you may or may not see this, depending on what the website's actually doing and stuff like this. These, in a sense, should be relevant to what the information is. Again, I will put a little asterisk saying it depends on the developer. Developer does not use nav for navigation. Like a navigation bar, like, so you think like at the very top, like over here, like essentially, like, so you go to like, you know, different parts. They might not use it, or they might use it in an improper way. So just kind of be aware is that these are all kind of like up to the developer. But these basically replace the place of something called a div, which you'll see a lot of divs. And basically div is just a generic container. It says it contains stuff. And so you can see div tags a lot of different places. So essentially, if you see like header, nav, footer, you replace it with div, it more or less functions the same. It has a very specific meaning. So a header is like, you know, I won't go through the whole parts, but like header, you know, it's kind of like the top of your article. So that's kind of like what it represents. The nav, like I said, navigation is kind of like the navigation bar, like the little drop-down menus and stuff like that that you click on to get to like other parts of the website. Footer, same idea. Main is kind of like, again, for like an article, like the main part of it. You can see like a side, article, section, canvas. Canvas is really interesting. It's meant more for being able to draw on top of it and stuff like that, doing certain images and stuff like that. So you'll see that too. And there's a lot more that you can go into. For the most part, you're just gonna have to kind of see, like, usually you're gonna have to look at the website ahead of time and say like, what's the website structure look like? And then know what things to pull out from there. And then once you know general structure, hopefully you can optimize it and automate this by essentially just having to do the same thing over and over again. Okay, so HTML, there are different tags, basically XML, and you basically, usually you'll see these, mostly the elements right here. Okay. Any questions before I move on to CSS? Cool. All right. So yeah, hopefully this is all feeling pretty review for people who've already seen it a little bit. I'm not spending too much time. So CSS, I barely talk about this because we're not building a website, and most likely you will not actually be scraping against CSS just because that's what it is. But there's some important aspects of it that relate to HTML itself. So basically, CSS is I think it's cascading style sheets is what it stands for. So basically it just means that it puts style on your HTML instead of like really plain. You can do things like different colors and like different structures and different placements. There's also CSS3, which can add animations and stuff like that. Again, we're not going to talk about that because it's not really important for data science for the most part. I don't think I've ever seen anyone scrape against CSS. But there are parts, for example, class and ID. So you might see visually certain things that stick out. That might be based on its class or ID, and that might be giving you a clue saying, oh, these are similar things. So you can do an inspect element and see how those change. Class and ID are actually attributes that are in HTML. So I didn't directly refer to this, and I probably should have, but going back to like these attributes, what you might see, for example, is something like class equals, I don't know, strong link or something. Or let's put like strong. So like this class basically is saying it's a very specific type of like structure this should have. And basically you use CSS to go like this. This is really important because sometimes you can use this information to web scrape and say, look for specific parts. Similarly, you also have ID, okay, like this, ID and then some other reference to it. ID is that only one element in all the documents should have that same ID. So you shouldn't have ID strong and then another ID strong. You would say only that part, which is really useful for web scraping because then you can just find that specific element, find that ID, and pull from there. Note that you can also have, like I said before, you can have different, you can have multiple attributes in one spot too. So note that you can have multiple classes, for example, but you can only have one ID. I guess you could technically have, I don't know if you can actually do that. You might be able to have multiple IDs, but different IDs for each one. So you might have ID strong, ID class. I don't think that's, first of all, common practice, but also I don't think HTML actually allows it. But check it out, see if it happens. All right, cool. So that's CSS. And the way it refers to is basically with this dot names class, HName. These are usually found within the header or a separate sheet itself, like a separate document that the HTML refers to. And it'll look something like this. Okay, cool. any questions then over all this thing about HTML structure, CSS structure, kind of quick, like, view? Do we feel pretty comfortable in the sense that like what HTML is supposed to look like? All right, see some thumbs up. See Andy nodding. I know Lauren Sharonda's
Yes,
things are
I feel
okay, cool.
comfortable.
Cool. All right, cool. So I'll go ahead and move on to our web scraping part. So good, we have about 30-ish minutes left, so this will be a good time.